Lonely Planet started in the early 70s. I was just finishing doing a master's degree and I just got married a few months earlier. And Maureen, my very young wife, and me, still very young as well, decided we'd take a year off and we'd get travel out of our system. And we bought an old car in London and we drove it as far as it would go before it fell apart and we could walk away from it. And we actually drove it as far as Afghanistan. And then we carried on and eventually we ended up in Australia and we thought someone should do a book about this. And that was the start of Lonely Planet. Basically, I discovered pretty early on I was not a great engineer. Academically, I was not a great engineer. Engineering, mechanicking wise, I was not a great, but I was able to keep things going. So yeah, I could keep cars going and that did prove useful. These days, we all know the downside of travel as well. We've got Greta to remind us about that. And I agree with her, it's not all good, but travel does a lot of really good things as well. And I'm really pleased about that. And I'm always knocked out by people I meet who said, oh, Lonely Planet, I wouldn't have gone there if I hadn't had your guidebook. And we didn't show them the way, but we sort of sometimes just opened the door. And sometimes we gave people a little bit of a shove. And, that's great. I love that. We think of the places where we see lots of tourists and we think, well, everything's like that. And the thing is, it isn't. You can go to lots of places where you will be the only tourist in town. I've just been in Africa for the last month, and a couple of the places, definitely, they haven't seen a tourist in ages. And there's lots of places like that in the world. I often think the Pacific, we look at the Pacific and we see all the expensive tourists in Tahiti or the package tourists in Fiji or whatever. And then you go to the Solomon Islands and you think, tourists, where are they? So yeah, if you want to get off the beaten track, I'm always amazed when I go somewhere and I do something and I think, oh, that was pretty exciting. I remember I was in Tibet once and with some people and we were doing a really amazing walk. And we just got to the place we were about to start thinking, wow, we've got here. And we were in a four-wheel drive. And two guys turned up on bicycles. And they'd bought these bicycles in a bazaar in Pakistan and ridden up to China and down to Tibet. And I thought, well, that puts me in my place. I haven't been anywhere at all. It's an area of travel that's always intrigued me. The travel guides, they are an element of history. In some ways, travel guides like a snapshot of a place at one era. And if you go back to an old travel guide, you look at it and you think, oh, that's all changed. It wasn't that way. And I really rather like that. I like the fact that there were travel writers in different forms. Go back as far as you like. You can go back pre-BC, Herodotus, when he was writing his history of history, he was also in a way writing a history of travel. Tips for travel, they're the same as that they've always been. There's really two things if you're going to write something about travel. One is it's much easier if you're writing something that nobody else is writing about. If you're writing another guidebook to France or another article about the wonderful restaurants of Italy, you've got a lot of competition out there. So if you can do something different, that makes life much easier for you as a writer. But the other thing is you've got to be interesting. I've met people who could make the history of France sound boring when we know it isn't, or could make restaurants in Italy sound terrible when they aren't. But equally, people can go out there and take something that sounds as if it should be really boring and make it exciting. Well, if you can do both those things, if you can do something that nobody else is doing and you can make it exciting, you're on a winner. I had a good time at Warwick, and I think a lot of it, is not the sort of the things you think it's going to be. It's not going to be the classes or the extracurricular activities and so on. They weren't bad, but it's things that are unexpected. And I think, although I said that engineering was useful in keeping cars going when you're trying to get them all the way to Afghanistan, really the most useful thing I did at Warwick was not one of my courses at all. It was working on the university newspaper. There it was. I learned about how to put a publication together. And back in those days, it was a century, it feels like a century before desktop publishing. This was when you had things typed out and typeset and cut up and pasted down. It was a whole different ball game. But what I learned from that was how to put a publication together And that really was the most important thing when we started Lonely Planet, that we did these books ourselves, and I knew how to put them together. And I'd learned that from Warwick. I think a lot of people get into publishing, that how they start is something at university, and it's not the course. It's not doing English and therefore you're writing in English, or history and you're writing a history book. It's something entirely different. I'm not writing a book at the moment, and I'm very often am writing a book. The most recent one I wrote was a book about the islands of Australia. The National Library of Canberra, Australia, asked me to write this book, and it was great fun to do. But I'm not writing a book at the moment, but I'm always writing something. And I've just spent a month in Africa, and I know I'm going to write a number of, I don't know where they're going to appear, but something will get into print on it. I could say lots of things about Warwick, that it's the mere fact it's been going for so long. And I didn't even intend to come to Warwick. I was just in that, you finish school and you're doing this and that, and and somehow you end up at a university. And the university I ended up at was Warwick. And I didn't realize at the time what a wise choice this was. But I've had plenty of reminders over the years that if I was going to choose a university, I chose a good one.